Okay.
We all good?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks, John. Okay. First, I'd like to welcome everybody to the October 6th River Falls Planning Commission meeting. First thing we'll do is say the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance,
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. Brandy, can we have a roll call, please?
Moody?
Here.
LaRue? I see her. Watson?
Here.
Hinsman? I see Hinsman, but he's on mute. Rebecca is here. Craig Hoffman is here.
Here.
And the mayor is here. That is all.
Okay. Let's hop right into it then. We'll start with the minutes from the September 1st Planning Commission meeting, and I'll take a motion on those.
I'll move to approve the minutes from the September 1st meeting.
I second.
Brandy?
I did.
Okay. So we got a first and second. Any questions or discussion on the minutes? Okay, Christy, if you want to do, or Christy, sorry, I'm so used to council meetings. Sorry, Brandy, if you want to do a roll call.
Sure. Moody?
Here.
LaRue?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Watson?
Yes.
Hinsman?
I see him.
Yes. Prendergast?
Yes.
And Hoffland?
Here.
And Mayor?
Yes.
Okay. Minutes are passed.
Okay. Next, move on to public comments. John, is there anybody at City Hall? Or do we have?
No, there isn't anyone here.
Okay. Nobody online or anything?
Correct.
Okay. So
Patricia's the only one that's called in, so you're on the phone, Patricia. So that's it.
we did have somebody that called in?
No,
No, it's
just
just, for some reason I can't hear you on my computer,
Oh.
so I called in, so I have audio.
Oh. Okay. Thanks. Way to
That's
go.
all.
Okay, let's go on to agenda item number 2, which is a consideration of an ordinance repealing and replacing chapter 17.120 of the Floodplain Ordinance of the Municipal Code. And Sam will give us a presentation on this. Take it away, Sam.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right?
yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for being patient. All right, good evening, Mayor and Plan Commission. Tonight, we have a new draft floodplain ordinance to replace our existing ordinance, and I'll briefly explain what the new ordinance entails, since it kind of came out of nowhere. State law requires that the city adopts a floodplain ordinance, and we were notified by the DNR in July that we would have to update our ordinance by the end of this year, so December 2020, to comply with FEMA and DNR requirements. A flood insurance study, or FIS, was recently completed for Pierce County. So that sort of triggered that requirement. It updated flood insurance rate maps, which are called FIRMs, which I'll talk about in a bit. They're panels that show where the floodplain's boundaries are, and they affect where development can or cannot be located. The only boundary changes in Pierce County occurred for Spring Valley and areas that are close to Spring Valley that are unincorporated, but there weren't any changes to boundaries within the city of River Falls or nearby. On the screen, you can see an example of what a firm panel looks like. Each panel has its own number and date, and there's different zones such as A, AE or AE floodway. I'll explain those in a bit. But if you're ever curious about where floodplain boundaries are in the city for a specific site, you can follow this link and it will take you to a search engine where you can look up firm panels straight from FEMA. So now's a good time to quickly just review how our floodplain ordinance works. In general, development is restricted in the 100-year floodplain, which is also called the general floodplain district. This refers to an area where there is a 1% chance of flooding every year, but that doesn't necessarily mean that only one flood will happen every 100 years. It's more of a probability measurement. Restricting development in this floodplain, it prevents loss of life, loss of property, and preserves community resources when you think of emergency response. The three districts that we use throughout our ordinance and in the new model one before you tonight are general floodplain, floodway, and flood fringe. So the general floodplain, again, is the estimated 100-year floodplain, which can be split into the floodway and the flood fringe. So you can see in the figure below, the general floodplain district is that upper area where you see the waves. And then the floodway and the flood fringe are delineated sort of vertically depending on where you are relative to the channel. So first, that general floodplain is identified using tools such as air photos. But if you do an on-site analysis, then that gives you the elevations that help you determine where the floodway and the flood fringe are located. And there's different regulations for each zone. So when you do that on-site analysis, the general floodplain designation goes away and then it becomes floodway or flood fringe. So it's basically a before and after sort of analysis. So during a flood, the floodway acts like a conveyor belt where its job is to convey floodwaters downstream rapidly. It's where you notice the current. And then the flood fringe is the shallow pooled up areas along the edges of the river. And they mainly just store water and slowly release it into the river channel as the waters recede. Firm panels identify the floodway as AE floodway and the flood fringe as just AE. But then areas where there's no elevations, where it's still only the general floodplain district, is zone A. Within the city limits, elevations are available in most of the locations, so we can easily determine whether something's in the floodway or the flood fringe in most of the city. If you don't know the flood fringe or floodway, there is a process in the draft ordinance and in the existing ordinance where an engineer has to do an analysis that shows where those are. That actually occurred when we built the Hoffman Park basins, and it took a lot of properties out of the floodplain downstream once the water was retained. There are other zones in firm panels, such as AI, AO, and AH, but they exist in coastal locations that don't apply to the River Falls area, so we won't likely see those anytime. So let's review the draft ordinance in detail. DNR provided city staff with a new model ordinance that meets all federal and state requirements. The long numbers that refer to the firm panels and flood insurance study that apply to the city of River Falls are contained in this ordinance, and that changed with the flood insurance study update. We were required to add a section of the ordinance that gives Plan Commission authority to review and recommend floodplain ordinance, both for adoption and for amendments. And that's exactly what you're doing tonight. Another example of when you might do that is if the city expands into an adjoining firm panel that we're not currently in, you guys would recommend bringing that firm panel into the ordinance as well. Since the model ordinance was carefully designed to meet both the state and federal requirements, deviations from the model can quickly result in non-compliance. The city does have the option to be more restrictive than the model ordinance, but it does not appear that the city has taken that approach in the past. This could be due to the city's robust shoreline zoning that restricts development within or near floodplains, regardless of what the floodplain ordinance allows. For example, limited accessory structures are permitted in the flood fringe below the flood elevation in the existing ordinance, but not in the new one. So that's an example of where it's getting more strict. Another change is that obstructions to the flow and increases to the floodplain height currently can't raise flood elevation greater than 0.1 feet. But the new ordinance says 0.0 feet, so no detectable change can occur if you develop within the floodplain. But in both examples, the shoreline zoning would prohibit these structures anyways, so there's not really a drastic change for property owners in the city of River Falls. The draft ordinance does allow some development in the flood fringe if there is fill added that raises the land out of the floodplain without an increase to downstream floodwaters. In cases where the flood fringe extends beyond the shoreline setback, someone could propose filling and developing the flood fringe. It's staff's understanding that there are very few areas where this occurs. They're primarily within city parks, and they're very small areas that are difficult to access and not desirable building sites. We've had discussions with local engineers, and they've indicated to us that the process to meet all the state and federal requirements that goes into being able to have permission to fill in the floodplain is very complicated, time-consuming, not cost-effective. So it's unlikely that we'll see a proposal like that. And then before we get into a recommendation, I just want to point out a housekeeping item. After this packet was sent to you guys, the city attorney reviewed it and just caught a few cross-references that we will update prior to forwarding this to council. For example, the model ordinance came with statutory references for both cities and villages, and we don't need to include the villages one because that doesn't apply to us. So just a few technical things that we'll clean up. And finally, the recommendation is to forward the draft floodplain ordinance to City Council with a favorable recommendation. This would repeal the city's existing floodplain zoning ordinance and adopt the attached draft floodplain zoning ordinance as chapter 17.120 of the city's municipal code. The next steps include the usual first and second reading of the ordinance by council with the public hearing and consideration for adoption at the November 10th council meeting. At that time, staff will submit the ordinance that is adopted to Wisconsin DNR for certification, and then the project is finished. That's all I have for this one. Back to you, Mayor.
No motion? Anybody?
Mr.
Wait, we
Mayor,
can't hear you.
I'd like to make a motion to pass the repeal and replace chapter 17.1 for the floodplain ordinance municipal code.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
second.
Okay, well, so we got a first and a second now. Questions? Anybody?
This is Patricia. I have a few just basic questions.
Okay, go ahead, Patricia.
On page 6 of this ordinance, it's under 17.12.030. That very first paragraph, it says general standards applicable to floodplain districts. It says the community shall review all permit applications. Who's the community?
I'm assuming the planning commission is Sam?
So if you go to the zoning administrator section at the end under administration, I'm trying to find where that is because it's down a ways. 17.120.080, that's page 55 of the packet. It starts out with a zoning administrator who advises applicants, issues permits, inspects damaged structures, keeps records, that sort of thing. Plan Commission does what they're doing tonight. We're reviewing the ordinance or amendments to it, and then Board of Appeals would do variances. So it's a pretty familiar structure. It's almost like a development review structure where an applicant would bring all these required site plan, engineering studies, and that sort of stuff before being able to be issued a permit.
Okay, so when this references that the community is supposed to do something, it's all of those different organizations.
Yeah, and this is where I believe that the model was written just to be flexible from community to community, and we might be able to tighten up the language to make it more specific, but I'm interpreting it to be that way, unless Amy or Brandy has other thoughts.
I think
It's
it's
just
intended to
in
be
there
the
a couple
city.
times. And who
Here.
is our zoning administrator?
Brandy, me, and Amy all have made zoning determinations, so any one of us.
Yeah, I believe in the code, it's the city or the community development director, planning director, or their designee.
So
Okay,
the word
that's-
community covers all of the entities of the review process. Is that what your question is, Patricia? Is the community, the word community means plan commission, community development person, or whoever?
Yeah, I just didn't know because it's in there 4 or 5 times. It says the community shall do this. And I'm like, and who is that?
So who is the community is your question, is the word community, who is that?
Yeah.
It's all these people on the screen, I think.
There you go. And I do have some like typo, commas, that kind of thing that I found, some double writing where it wasn't structured and probably should, but I'll do that personally. I'll send an email. That's
Okay,
all my
sounds good.
comments.
Yeah, I caught like an indent or two that was misaligned, so thanks.
Yeah.
Anything else, Patricia?
Nope. I
Okay.
just didn't know who was who.
Good
Okay.
question, though. Thank you.
Who's next? Anybody else have anything?
I just wanted to make a comment, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Watson.
Just following on something Sam said, where we're going to be looking at the shoreland ordinance coming up, and in a couple of places in your presentation, you mentioned that there, practically speaking, there wouldn't be a change in the net effect of from our current floodplain regulations, zoning regulations to this one, because A, there aren't that many places where those problems, would show up, but B, because given our shoreland setback ordinance, building wouldn't be able to happen in those areas. And I just wanted to, there's a caveat there in that if we do change our shoreland setback ordinance, then it would have an effect on some of the practical implications of this zoning ordinance here. So just a heads up, I guess, to everybody that, if we shrink or narrow the shoreline setback, it would, these two things do kind of play with each other or have an effect on each other. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
I was just gonna say, by adding the plan commission section to the ordinance, say we get through shoreline and you say, well, let's take a look at floodplain again and see if there's something we want to revisit, you have that authority to go back and recommend another amendment, essentially.
Okay. Good.
Thanks, Sam. Any other questions or comments on this? Okay. Brandy, we have a first and a second on this.
Moody,
Yay.
LaRue,
Yes.
Watson,
Aye.
Hinsman. Yes. Prendergast
Yes.
and Hoffland
Aye.
and Mayor.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay. Next, we'll go on to the director's report with Amy Peterson. Amy, what did you have for us?
Yeah, so hopefully you had a chance to take a look at the director's report. Just a few things on the first page that are items of note that I'll touch base with you on. Our next meeting is shifted to November 17th due to the election. So just want to make sure everybody's got that on their calendars. We do have some upcoming work that we're going to start this evening again. So for those of you that are new to the Planning Commission, And Sam will go over this in just a little bit, but we had started looking at our shoreline zoning ordinance earlier this year. And then it was put on pause due to COVID. So we're going to start that back up again here. And tonight in our workshop, it'll simply be some background to get everybody up to speed and on the same page again. And just looking ahead to next year already, we're 3 months out from there, but we're probably going to be looking at some sort of an amendment for breweries, wineries, brew pubs, and distilleries. And then a little further down the road, staff is starting to draft part of a scope and process to begin the update of our comprehensive plan, which we anticipate beginning next year. So with that, I will take any questions you may have.
This is Patricia. It talks about 5 new, where is it? 5 new future projects and developers. Is there a place I can go and find what those are?
Can you give
It's
me
on
a
the
page?
second page. Yep, second page. It says projects, working with developers on inquiries for 5 future projects.
Okay. So typically until a developer submits an application to the city, we don't discuss them because technically it's the project. So this is just to let you know that staff typically starts those conversations way early before an actual application is submitted. So.
Okay.
And I guess I'll just add, when an application is submitted, if all of you have been to the city's development map, once an application is submitted, it's added to that map. So that's a really good place to go to get the updated information. Oh, Mayor, I think you're muted.
Anybody else have anything for Amy on this? Or anything? Otherwise, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Mayor, I move to adjourn.
I'll second.
And we have first and second to adjourn.
Moody,
Hmm?
Liver,
Yes.
Hudson,
Aye.
Hinsman? Yes. Prendergast
Yes.
and Hoffland
Hi.
and the mayor.
Aye.
Okay.
Okay, we are adjourned and we'll go into our workshop. Well, Sam, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, thanks for sticking around. Let me quick bring up my other presentation here. All right. Thanks for sticking around after the meeting. We're ready to go?
Is this meeting still a public meeting and to be streamed and things like that?
Yes.
Yeah, plan, yeah,
Okay.
any kind of,
Okay.
yeah.
Right.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Any kind of workshop.
All right, so thanks for sticking around. Like Amy said, some of you probably remember reviewing shoreline wetland and shoreline zoning before COVID hit. And we have a few new members since then. So this is a quick overview to get everyone back up to speed and back into shoreline mode. So it's been about over 6 months since everything changed. So the goal of tonight's meeting, we're also going to provide some next steps and give you a question or an opportunity to ask questions. So let's get started. So here's a quick overview of how the shoreline zoning works. The ordinance uses a calculation to determine each property's shoreline setback. which varies on each site's based on their physical characteristics. So first, there's a minimum setback that's determined for each stream based on its size, and those range from 125 feet for the Kinnickinnic River down to 75 feet for the smaller tributaries. Then, if there are steep slopes present, they add 25 or 50 feet to the setback depending on how steep they are. And then finally, the setback expands to surround floodplains and wetlands with an additional 25 feet. These distances add up to the full setback where you can't have pavement or structures within. And you can see this on the map. So we have the water in blue, and then the setback is the colors outside of the blue. So once you find that setback, it's divided into the 3 zones. As you move closer to the river, the activities allowed in each zone get more restrictive. So zone 1 is the inner 25 feet. That's the least disturbed area. The middle zone sort of varies in width to make up the difference of the setback. And then the outer zone is the least restrictive, but you still can't put pavement or structures in it. The goal for the setback is to protect the plants and the soils to prevent erosion, and then having that buffer allows water to sort of slowly filter back into the river and cool down before it enters the river, which is important with trout habitat and river health. So let's move on. So in the pre-1982 area, our large setbacks are still fully enforceable and they're pretty wide. And in the green area, we can only go up to a maximum of 75 feet. This is because of a recent change to state law. And I guess the rationale that went into that is that when county shoreline zoning was introduced at 75 feet in 1982, well, if it gets annexed, then all these buildings could become non-conforming. And that's sort of why the state made that call. So really, it kind of provides a challenge for us. And there's other tools I'm going to discuss later, though, that we can hopefully explore. So let's go back to what the state defines a shoreline as. All lands within 1,000 feet of navigable lakes, flowages, or ponds, and all lands within 300 feet of a navigable stream edge of a floodplain, whichever is greater. It's important to understand this concept before we move on, since the shoreline area is larger than what our existing setback refers to. So if you take that shoreline definition and apply it to the city, this is what it looks like in gray. Lake George and Lake Louise, you can see it expands to 1,000 feet, but those will go back down to 300 feet after the dam removal. Are there any questions so far?
Area in gray here is what the state considers the shoreline zone. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. So the requirements we discuss apply to areas in the gray.
Okay.
And this is where it gets confusing because you have a 300-foot buffer, but you can't do a 300-foot setback in much of the city. It's more, all the properties are considered shoreline properties. If they fall into this area, all wetlands in this area are shoreline wetlands. So we'll get into more detail later in this presentation, but also when we revisit in future meetings, we'll get even more detailed.
Thank you.
All right, guess I'll move on. So here's a good way to differentiate between shoreline wetland zoning and shoreline zoning. So the shoreline wetland zoning portion of the ordinance applies to all wetlands within that 300-foot buffer you just saw, whether they are adjacent to a body of water or not. Shoreline wetland zoning is easily confused with shoreline zoning because they sound so similar, but they're actually 2 different programs. As you can see, one is NR 117 in the state code and one is NR 115. The best way to think of it is shoreline wetland zoning regulates uses within the wetlands that are within that shoreline area. But shoreline zoning is more, has to do with placement of structures, things like setbacks, vegetation, impervious surfaces, things that are more things you can see that are related to the built environment and the intensity of development. An example of a shoreline wetland regulation would be hunting is permitted in a wetland, or harvesting of stumps is not permitted, and we'll get into more detail later. So because we're required to have separate ordinances, the first step is to sort of split up what we have. So shoreline wetland becomes its own ordinance, and then because of the different state rules regarding what we can and cannot do between the pre-1982 lands and the post-1982 lands, it's going from a one combined ordinance into a three-part ordinance. So let's start with wetlands. The protection of shoreline wetlands is essential to protect river quality, and our existing ordinance does not protect them uniformly, and it also does not protect all wetlands within that 300-foot shoreline area. So the new approach has a more uniform and more effective way of regulating uses within these wetlands, and they protect a greater share of the wetlands associated with the river. So you can see our current ordinance protects what's in pink, and then the proposed one protects, it adds the lime green onto the pink. And this is just a part of the city. There's far more wetlands if you go upstream out of the city limits, which you also need to think long-term into what could come into the city someday when evaluating these ordinances. So the policy decisions we have for these wetlands are basically, what are the list of permitted and prohibited uses? We'll talk about that next month in more detail. And then also, what is the minimum acreage of each wetland that the ordinance should apply to? At the bare minimum, we're supposed to apply this to everything 5 acres and up, but we have the option to go all the way down to 1 square foot. All right, so shoreline zoning gets a little more complex. It's more directly tied to the intensity and the location of development near rivers. On the right side of the image, again, I showed you it before, it's where our ordinance is no longer enforceable in all of that green area, which is quite a bit of the city. And then on the left side, you can see downtown where we are allowed to enforce the full setback. There are several properties that are non-conforming and they can't redevelop easily and turn into something that maybe has better stormwater management on it. Ideally, we'd have shorter setbacks downtown and wider ones out in the country where the greater for change is, the potential for change is greater out in the country where you're going from undeveloped land to developed land. But with the stuff that's already developed, it might make more sense to say, well, let's encourage redevelopment that has better stormwater controls on it. But thankfully, there's other tools that we can evaluate. We'll get into this in more detail at future meetings, but things like impervious surfaces and minimum lot sizes can be enforced under shoreline zoning, and it might help make up for the reduction in setback that we're required to do, especially in the post-1982 areas. Finally, there's also a lot of steep slopes, floodplains, and wetlands that are both upstream and downstream from the city limits that make development difficult to do to begin with. That's due to other ordinances, like our subdivision ordinance doesn't allow building on 20% or greater slopes anyways. Excuse me. So again, just to recap, the structure is changing. One benefit to this also is if there are more state law changes like there have been in the last few years, it's easy to just amend it because they're already portioned out rather than having to start over each time state law changes. So our anticipated timeline is that we'll bring the draft shoreline wetland zoning ordinance to you next month. Note the date is a little different because of elections. We already discussed the permitted and prohibited uses within wetlands at a previous meeting, but that was a long time ago. So we'll run down that list again and get your thoughts on it. And hopefully we can review it and recommend it to council at that time. Then following the meeting, we'll go into a workshop, get into the more details of the shoreline zoning. And then in future meetings, depending on how long it takes, if you guys come up with ideas and then I need to research with DNR what's possible and what's not possible, that might take some time, but it leaves the door open to really thoroughly explore all the options we have before us. And then at the end, we'll bring all 3 ordinances to council at the same time. That way they can be repealed and replaced all concurrently so that there's no weird overlap between new and old ordinances. And that's all I have for now. So if you have any questions, let me know.
Whoever, anybody's got questions?
Hey, Sam, is this presentation available to us so we can review this?
Yeah, I can email it to you.
Yeah, because there's a lot to this.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why we wanted to make it more of a workshop to give you a chance to ask questions, but I know it's a lot to soak in before you might even know what questions to ask. So,
Could
and
you
I'm
send it to
available for,
Patricia too?
what was that?
Could you send it to Patricia too, please?
Yep, I'll write it down.
You can just send it, probably just send it to everybody, Sam.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
This is, the DNR and the state have done a great job of making this as confusing as they possibly can.
Well,
Yeah, unfortunately,
I'm sure that has to do a little bit with FEMA.
both, I'm under the impression both floodplain and shoreline is swamped too with just revisions statewide. So it's been a challenge really tracking down the latest in terms of what we can and can't do.
Oh, Hal, if I may ask you a question, do you have much experience with this as a in your background?
Really, just in the sense that I was on the plan. I can't remember if it was the plan commission or council when we adopted the current ordinance. So I have a memory of that and kind of the arguments and some of the back and forth that happened, primarily around the shoreland setback piece of it. I like the fact that, you know, they're splitting these out into separate pieces. I think that makes it easier to understand. And I think that's helpful. I'll have some comments, you know, when it comes to the setback specifically, you know, discussion. But I don't want to bog things down right here, but feel free if you want to shoot me an email or something, we can talk.
Yeah, I'm a little bit confused to the pre-1982 and how much of the city is affected by that. I think you did I hear 20%, Sam? Is that, or I can't remember that figure, but
So 20% was that was associated with slopes. So anywhere in the city, if there's a slope greater than 20%, you can't develop it.
okay. Yep.
Right. Sam did have a map in the presentation that shows the area pre-19, and it has,
Yeah.
1982 has to do, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, with the area that was brought into the city or zoned within the city before 1982 and after 1982.
Yeah, it's basically the 1982 city limits.
Okay. So what they're saying is the area that was annexed essentially after 1982, we have no choice about the setback part of this rule and probably a few other pieces of it. In the area before 1982, our current ordinance could stay, or the parts of our ordinance that apply, like the setbacks and the calculations that we currently do with slope and a few other things, we can continue to kind of have our own fine-tuned rule about the area in white there, but not the area in green. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm. You know, you mentioned this. You know, and this last meeting we had, or in the city council, or that wasn't actually. It was with the what was it? Was the property next to the river?
Yes.
So that one is intriguing because I look at this and think, you know, does a city engineer, do we know exactly what we have currently in that white with as far as
right? So this map, this inset with the orange and the yellow and the blue is what currently applies to that property that's within or was platted before 1982. And really most of the kind of heart of the downtown, adjacent to the Kinney and the South Fork. So we can tell, and I don't want to speak for staff, so, but we can tell landowners, we can show them these maps, and they can see the line where they can and cannot, redevelop if they tear down a house. But again, I think Sam will want to get into this in more detail. There are not caveats, but there's ways to, in the current shoreline ordinance, or sorry, the current setback portion of the ordinance, where you can rebuild, to the same footprint that you currently, like if your house burned down, you can rebuild in the same footprint, even if you were not, or if you were kind of out of compliance because of the way the ordinance reads right now, but your house was built a long time ago and stuff like that. So I think those are good discussions to have at maybe the next workshop around some of those details.
If I may, there just a couple notes, and the image that you see on the left with the yellow, red, and orange doesn't show a section of code that provides the downtown with a 75 shoreline setback. So that's a piece that we'll discuss too. And I just want everybody to know this is really complex stuff, and it is very good that we're able to break it out into 3 sections. And staff is working really hard to distill all of this information down for you into the policy decisions that you are going to need to make. And we do intend to provide recommendations, and we've been digging into research to support those recommendations for you so that you've got a solid ordinance before you when it comes time for you to review these. So.
Anybody else have questions right now? Amy or Sam, you guys have anything more for us right now?
No.
I would just quick mention that when you see these wetland maps, this is what is likely a wetland. And then just like a floodplain, if you investigate it any further, you do an on the ground measurement to confirm or modify where its boundaries are. But that'll come into play next time.
Okay. Was everybody okay then?
Just send me this presentation. That would be wonderful.
And Brandy and Sam and Amy are there to help anybody along with any questions they might have before meetings and everything. So don't hesitate to get a hold of them.
Yeah, feel free to call me.
Yep.
Sometimes this stuff is easy to explain in person.
Oh. Okay. Okay then. I guess I'll thank everybody for showing up tonight. Thanks Sam. Thanks Amy. Thanks Brandy. Thanks for the Planning Commission for showing up. And I guess we can call it a night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Everybody
Good night,
take
everyone.
care.
You too.